It is truly an honor to be here today. Thank you so much for including me in this magnificent gathering. So most people assume that ninth graders who have failed multiple grades, have GPAs as low as 0, who have grown up in neighborhoods beset with drugs and violence, are simply a lost cause, that if you haven't reached a child by the age of 5, it is too late. And after spending a decade in Baltimore getting to know our young people, I can tell you that that is not true. And I'm going to share with you how Thread is both supporting our students in beating the odds and changing the odds for all students in Baltimore City. Thread's model is groundbreaking. We enroll high school freshmen who rank in the bottom quartile of their class. At Douglas High School, the school that was at the epicenter of the unrest in Baltimore last year, our most recent cohort had an average incoming GPA of 0.15. Not 1.5, 0.15 on a 4.0 scale. Our students are often at the bottom of many statistical scales, whether that be income, access to resources, or educational opportunity. Once in Thread, students remain for 10 years, the rest of high school and 6 years after high school. Yes, longer than our average American marriage. We lovingly joke that we're sort of like a gang or a sorority. Once you're in, you can't get out because it's family. And our students, once enrolled, are given a group of up to 5 volunteers who do everything from pack their lunches to give them rides to school to go for ice cream on a Saturday. Imagine anything that you would do for your own child, that is what we do for ours. We rethink the definition of family to include our students and our volunteers, and it's the sophistication of our model that allows us to never give up on a student over a decade. So I'm going to share with you a story, but I know you hear many stories, and then I'm going to share with you how this story is representative of hundreds of stories in Baltimore, and it sets the stage for a radical shift in how we think about engaging young people. Maurice is a student that I met 12 years ago when he was a freshman. Years earlier, his mom, addicted to drugs, had abandoned him on a street corner. Unable to fend for himself, he fell into life on the streets. By the time we met, he was failing out of school, getting ready to drop out. And so we just started with the basics. So I would give him rides to school, I would make sure he had lunch. We went on a camping trip in the middle of January with 8 inches of snow on the ground. I was very inexperienced at that time and didn't understand that wasn't a great idea. And at the time, my biggest argument with Maurice was whether or not he could bring his gun on the camping trip. So it took a lot of time to build the relationship and to gain the trust, but eventually we started to turn a corner. Maurice eventually graduated from high school, and this past May received his college degree from Coppin State University. But that's not all. He has also begun to emerge as a leader in our community, most recently joining Thread's board of directors. So he's gone from arguing with me about bringing a gun to arguing about my salary as my new boss. But that's not all. Maurice loved going on the camping trips, and years after his very first one in January, he met a young man named Malcolm on one of our camping trips, and they became friends. Maurice started driving him to school, and all of a sudden, Malcolm would change the address at which he was asking to be picked up in the morning. Well, having been homeless himself, Maurice understood exactly what that meant. So what did he do? He and his fiancée, Stephanie, offered to have Malcolm move in with them. He started giving him rides to school, packing his lunches, making sure that he could see the very concrete next steps of how to build a different life. So fast forward now to April 27th of last year. I come out of my back-to-back meetings and I look down at my cell phone and it's exploded. There's text messages from Maurice. Before I can even call him to find out what is going on, I'm looking down at my phone and it says, "Get over to Douglas now. It's about to go down. Hurry up. Get the staff." And all of a sudden I see this picture come through, and it's a selfie of Maurice and Malcolm, and they are driving away from Douglas just as so many young people were beginning to stand off with the police. So in this moment of complete chaos, Maurice said to me, "Get all the volunteers. We have to locate all of our students." Well, it took until 2 a.m., but we eventually found everyone, and it was Maurice really who had been the leader that day in rallying everyone to find our students and ensure that they were both safe physically, but also safe emotionally and mentally. Over the next few weeks, we started to have a lot of conversations to reflect, to process what had happened. Sometimes they were in our office, sometimes they were in my living room. And one student said, what if everyone who had come into West Baltimore from outside had just gotten the phone number of one other person who they had never met before and agreed to have a conversation with them once a month for 30 minutes for a year? How would that have fundamentally changed our city, thinking about the relationships that would have been formed? So this insight sparked the idea, which we then followed through on a year later, where we brought together over 1,000 people in Baltimore at 100 dinners at 100 unique locations, all on one night, with no other agenda other than to get to know one another. So I go back to my initial thought. So many people would think of Maurice as a lost cause. But not only is he not a lost cause, he is the critical leadership that we need in our city and in our society moving forward. So I ask a very basic question. It's super simple. We know that if kids go to school, they're more likely to graduate. If they're more likely to graduate, they're more likely to end up with a productive job. So over the years, after picking a lot of kids up for school, I realized it came down to simply influencing a single decision every day. If I could just influence this one decision, if I could just get a kid to go to school, then I could have an impact on so many things that came after. And I realized that this framework of decision making, we all make decisions in the same way. Lots of people would say, well, why don't kids just go to school? They're just being lazy. Why don't they get up and try harder? The truth is they're actually making rational decisions given how the brain works. So what does our brain look at when we go to make decisions? Let's say the decision is, am I going to go to school or am I going to do something else? The something else might be sleeping because you're so depressed you can't get out of bed. The something else might be working a job because you need money to support yourself. So let's go through that decision. The first thing your brain is going to look at is reward. So let's say that something else is selling drugs. You might earn $200 a day for selling heroin in Baltimore City. If you go to school, graduate, get into college, graduate, get a middle-class job, maybe you're going to earn $400 a day. The problem is the $200 is now, so it's more valuable. So already in the equation of decision making, we're losing. The second thing your brain looks at, though, is it looks at likelihood. So it basically says, what is the likelihood that if I go to school, graduate, get a middle-class job, I will actually receive $400 a day? Or what is the likelihood that if I go and sell drugs, I'm actually going to get $200 today? So it's very simple. Your brain just plays the reel back of all the things that you've seen. So if you have a ton of data points that say, if I sell drugs, I'm going to get $200, it says this is a sure bet. If you don't know anyone who's graduated from high school, gotten into college, graduated, gotten a middle-class job, it's like telling me that I should go to the moon tomorrow, and if I'm like, that's difficult, you're like, try harder, you're just lazy. It's ridiculous, right? But this is what we do to our young people every day. So in Thread, what we really try to think about is, how do we change the equation? How do we provide real rewards? How do we actually change the likelihood function? How do we create data points for our young people that say, this is possible, it is happening? So once students are enrolled in Thread, as I mentioned, they receive a group of volunteers, and the volunteers are not there to replace their family. Instead, they're there to integrate into their existing network. So the 5 volunteers, one of them might drive a student to school, but another one might help the parent find a job, and another one might help the younger sibling get enrolled in Head Start. The idea is to integrate into the existing network and form an extended family. We kind of view ourselves like neighbors. The challenge is that oftentimes our young people and their families face things that are beyond our comprehension or expertise. So in addition to the family structure, Thread has what we call resource teams. So there's a legal team, a housing team, health, academics, workforce development. So if a student's being evicted, instead of the 5 volunteers having to try and figure out how to prevent an eviction, they can simply go to the legal team, and the legal team will help them connect with a pro bono legal provider in our community. So what does this lead to? Well, creating relationships that transcend lines of race and class in our city, where everyone benefits, lead to 100% of our students continuing to be engaged after 12 years of Thread. %, and remember, these are the students coming in the bottom quartile of their class, 92% have graduated from high school within 5 years of joining Thread. And 80% of our students who are now alumni who have been in Thread for over a decade have received a 4 or 2-year college degree or certification. So if we think about how do we do this for every child, what does it actually take? It turns out it's quite simple. All a child needs is one consistent caring adult in their life. That's it. And so when I think about the math in Baltimore City, we have hundreds of thousands of adults. We have about 80,000 students in our school system. So in theory, we should have extra adults. Where are they? Are they lazy? No, they're just working with the same data set that our young people are working with. So when you think about what is our challenge, it's both providing evidence and rewards in real time to our young people, but it's also getting out to the community that our young people can succeed. There is not a single young person who is disposable, that is a lost cause. It is not only possible, but it is happening. So when we think about what is happening in Thread, this year we will serve over 300 students and their families with the support of over 1,000 volunteers and collaborators. We've also laid out a plan to reach 5% of every freshman class across the school district. Reaching that scale in Baltimore while maintaining the same outcomes would dramatically shift the high school graduation rate in our city. But there's something even more important that would happen. It would take 3,000 students, 7,000 volunteers, the family members of those students, volunteers, collaborators, donors, board members, staff. All in, it would be about 20,000 adults in Baltimore City, tightly woven in relationships that are meaningful to everyone. That's not just 5% of every freshman class in our school district, that's 5% of the entire adult population in the city. Those are the early adopters for a social justice movement. So when we think about why does this matter, we know that relationships matter for the health of a city. Sean Stafford went into 2 towns, Youngstown and Allentown, who had very similar demographics in terms of race, religious preference, class. But they had dramatically different outcomes in their city, and they wanted to understand why, because Allentown was crushing it in terms of the economy and crime and education. He said, how is that possible with the same demographic breakdown? So he went in and he realized it was something super, super simple. In Youngstown, we might bowl together, and we'd go to church together, and we worked at the factory together. But in Allentown, we bowled together, we went to church together, and we worked at the factory. It is the diversity in the social networks in Allentown that led to a thriving city. And relationships, they don't just matter in terms of the overall collective, they matter for each of us individually. The longest standing human research study in our country's history came also out of Harvard, looked at men from the time of their early 20s into their 80s. And it just wanted to understand what is going to determine if these men are happy and healthy in their 80s. And they thought it might be educational attainment or income. It turned out it was something much, much simpler. It was relationships. And it wasn't the quantity of relationships that they had. It wasn't how many friends they had on Facebook or how many likes they had on this. No, it was just the quality. It was, did they have a core group of people who, when it really mattered, had their back? The men who had that had less cancer, less dementia, less heart disease, right? So relationships matter for all of us. So when you think about what is the key to actually building relationships that transcend lines of race and class, it's super simple. The key is not defining success as only the student's progress. It's defining success and the ability to change and grow as our own. It's about how we show up. If we want young people to be responsible, we have to be responsible. If we want them to go to school, we have to show up when we say we're going to take them to school. If we want our young people to never give up, we have to never give up. And it's not just about showing up, but it's about how we show up. Are we actually vulnerable? Do we share our lives with them? Do we allow them to see us for who we really are? Do we allow them to help us? You know, when Maurice and I would go on rides to school in the morning, we rarely talked about academics. We would argue over what we were going to listen to on the radio. We would talk about his complicated relationship with his mom and talk about mine with my sister. When his brother died very suddenly, he shared his grief with me. And after many years of trying to have a child unsuccessfully, I shared mine with him. Years later, I collapsed, and it turned out I had an ectopic pregnancy. Emergency surgery, multiple blood transfusions, and some chemo later, I woke up. I woke up to a hospital room filled with Thread students, volunteers, staff, Maurice, Malcolm. It was all of my Thread family. They brought me back to life at a time where I wasn't even physically capable of asking for help. So in a time where things are often complicated, we have to remember that it's not just young people living in poverty that need deep interpersonal bonds. We all do. And in these times of division and strife, we must remember to get back and rediscover what is most important, one another. Thank you.